QSO Today, episode 242, Neil King, VA7DX. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, who is excited to announce the new ICOM IC9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Hans Sommer's G0UPL's kit company, and creators of many fine radio kits, including the popular QCX transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Links to both are in this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for VA7DX, your host. International DXpeditions to exotic locations around the world are what floats the amateur radio boat of my guest today, Neil King, VA7DX. With over 16 DXpeditions under his belt, Neil shares with us his background and expertise to continue to enjoy traveling and operating from some of the most remote locations in the world. As a resident of Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada, we also discuss the BCWARN microwave backbone that reinforces amateur radio emergency services there. VA7DX is my QSO today. VA7DX, this is Eric for VA7DX. Are you there, Neil?
I certainly am, Eric. How are you today?
I'm great, Neil. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
You're
start at the beginning? You're welcome. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, actually, the first time I was exposed to radio in general was more around commercial radio and also CB. This was when I was in a scouting organization, and we were doing some work with the local community to assist in, watching for crowds on Halloween and just a general indoctrination to radio. There was a large gap from then until I actually got involved in radio in a more serious way. I was involved in motorsports and racing a car up and down the west coast of the U.S., and we used CB radios actually to keep in touch with each other. And of course, at that time, we realized that there were more people from the east coast of the U.S. on the 11-meter band than there were people on the highway. That kind of tweaked my interest, and that flowed into ultimately taking the ham radio examination, and I did that and attained my first license in 1979. So I was a relative latecomer. I was 30 at that time, and got my advanced in 1980. Really just became totally absorbed with ham radio and talking to people from other parts of the world. And then ultimately got my current call, VA7DX, in late 1999.
Now, is VA7DX, is that a vanity call?
No, it's not. It's the calls for our call areas are fairly static. It's unlike the U.S., where nowadays you really can't tell where somebody comes from. Sixes could be from anywhere in the nation in the U.S. VE7 is British Columbia, and once the number of available VE7 calls ran out, VA7 was opened up. Some of my DXpedition and ham radio friends tell me it's a learner's license, but I put up with that as need be.
Well, VA7DX seems highly appropriate for the discussion we'll have a little bit later.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, so you were a relative newcomer, late bloomer, so you didn't get it as a kid, but it seems to have consumed quite a bit of your activity. Does it have anything to do, the interest in electronics or radio have anything to do with the career path that you've chosen and that you're on now?
Absolutely not, to be honest. I'd already established myself in the technology arena. I kind of fell into a job in the IT arena, and for the most part was self-taught, in addition to courses provided from the organizations that I worked for, but ultimately worked up through operations programming into management, which is a role that I've had for going on 50 years now, when I first started in the IT arena. So I'd already started well on that path within information technology and digital technologies by the time I really started getting interested in ham radio. I tend to burn my fingers on soldering guns, and I spend more time building antennas when I do have time than I do actually building equipment. I'm more of an appliance operator when it comes to radios themselves or amplifiers, but I've got a also quite an interest in RDF. I'm part of a group that tracks down bad guys treating repeaters poorly. So, I've spent some time building RDF units, and that kind of tweaked my interest in electronics to the extent that once I get into my retirement phase here, I'll be building some amplifiers for the VHF and UHF bands.
Now, as we're speaking today, it's mid-morning here in Israel, and it's mid-morning in South Africa, where you happen to be. Why are you in South Africa, and how does that work for you?
Actually, it works out quite well. I'm an IT consultant. I'm actually on a long-term engagement with a global mining exploration company. I first started off actually in 2010 with them. As I tell the story, I was sipping a coffee with my feet up on my desk at home, and I got a call from the CIO of this company saying, we got some problems in Beijing. Can you get there tomorrow? So about 4 days later, I was sitting at my desk running the IT organization in Beijing, trying to fix it. It was broken, failed some audits. And over the years, I've spent the majority of my time actually working with this company in a variety of roles, fixing broken IT organizations. Ultimately, lived in Beijing for 6 months doing that. Lived in Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, had a call sign JT1RF actually in Mongolia for a year. And now I've moved primarily to focus on the operations here in Africa. We have 3 major projects going on, and I've taken over essentially as CIO for the group, and will continue to do that until funding is solidified and the projects are well on their way. And I've organized the IT organizations in each jurisdiction to carry on and be able to do it without me, which is rapidly approaching.
So at this point in your career, you're no longer like really hands-on into the equipment and the processes themselves, but into the organization management and finding the right people to do the right jobs?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Eric. I've always had a fair technical knowledge, but in terms of detailed stuff, there are much better people at it than I am. My focus really in the last 25 years has really been around getting the right people that know the right stuff to get the job done. And I'm pretty good with people, so it seems. And that's, the exciting thing for me, and I saw this in Mongolia while I was there, and also here, is watching people begin to take some of the techniques that I use, modify it to suit their particular style, and then use that to be very effective in terms of meetings or, meeting project objectives or, working with other people. And that's kind of leaving a little bit of myself behind. I hope it's not sounding too vain, but leaving a bit of myself behind as a legacy. I really enjoy seeing people develop, and if I've had a little bit of a role to play in that, it's gratifying.
Now, you were saying that you spend something like 4 to 6 weeks in South Africa, and then you go back to Vancouver, where your home QTH is, and you're there for a short time, and then you go back and forth at this point?
Yeah, I've just got a bit longer commute than most people, yeah.
Do you operate from South Africa? Do you have some kind of portable rig that you take with you?
I don't. What I have done, actually, until about a year ago, my friend Zeta6RJ had a half-decent setup here in Pretoria, so I'd pop over there on weekends, and we'd run contests together, or I'd just operate from his place. I have spent time visiting other countries within Africa here, Botswana, Mozambique, Swazi, Lesotho, and operating Malawi. Operating from there, either primarily in DXpedition mode with Roger and a few others. We call it the Black Mamba DXpedition group. But in terms of operating, I'm pretty focused on work. I live in a hotel, and although I think they'd be happy to let me put something up in the roof, the noise here in the city and the location is such that I don't think it'd be very effective. So I focus primarily on work when I'm here. It's as a consultant, that's one of the things I just need to do, and not much time for ham radio. But I do have the flexibility of taking a week or two here while I'm in country, and as I say, I've visited a few other countries with the group and have had a lot of fun actually operating from other locations.
Now, the name Black Mamba, the expedition group, does that have anything to do with actually encountering a black mamba on a DXpedition?
No. The closest I've come to a black mamba was seeing one on the road in front of us out of the windshield of a car. I tend to like to be where those things aren't. I've come fairly close to a number of them, but not threatened by any.
Well, South Africa also has the cobra. I've seen pictures of the king cobra on the beach in Cape Town.
I'm heading up to DR Congo in March, and we were just talking about that as a group. And apparently, at one of our project sites, Cobra was spending a little bit of time in one of the washrooms. I think it was the ladies, but they've since relocated it. So typically, our projects are free of most critters that are going to hurt you. But hey, there's still projects are typically at least one of our projects is way out in the boondocks. So the snakes are just part of it. Spiders too.
In doing some research about you, Neil, it sounds to me that you are a big DXer. So that you're either working on DXpeditions. There's a whole list of them, I think over 16 that I have listed here on my show notes page, which I'll put in the show notes for the rest of the listeners.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How did you get to be a DXer, and how did that start for you?
Well, it's an interesting story. I'd always had an interest in operating from other locations, but hadn't really realized it to any great extent. Fairly early on, my buddy and I it was actually cheaper for us to ski in Switzerland than it was to ski at Whistler, just a few hours outside of Vancouver, believe it or not. It's going back quite a ways when the Swiss franc was favorable to the Canadian dollar. And on a number of occasions, I made a point of, my sister was living in Zurich at the time, so we'd stop in there and visit. But I always made a point of stopping by in Geneva and operating from, once I realized we could do this, operating from 4U1 ITU. And that kind of got the spark going, let's put it that way. It's kind of cool to be, in a place where people were really interested in talking to you. But I actually, first time I was there, I focused my attention primarily on working back to my own station. I'd arranged for somebody to pop in and operate from there at a certain time. And then that kind of morphed into other people on the West Coast while the opening was there. And then boom, all of a sudden, people from all over Europe were interested. It wasn't really until about 2003 that I had the opportunity to operate from Lesotho. I was asked to join a group, and in that group were K4SV Dave Anderson, who at that time had been on a couple of really major expeditions, and Madison Jones, W5MJ, who first time I'd met Madison as well too. But during the course of that first Lesotho expedition, just had a ton of fun, and really learned a lot from both Dave and Madison about operating at that end of the pileup. So that was quite that was a lot of fun. It really got my interest up in how to really start looking for other opportunities on DXpeditions. That first expedition in Lesotho as well too was kind of interesting because I'd never really run any satellite stuff, and AO40 was still operational at that time, and I ended up kind of taking over operating on it, and we just absolutely worked a ton of people on AO40. It kind of blew the minds of everybody there. And in fact, after we left Lesotho, Dave and I on our own went up to Swaziland and operated from there as well too. And in fact, unofficially, because we've never really advertised this, one of the individuals in Vancouver and I believe we have the record for the longest distance Q through AO40, because we were actually in Thibodeau at that time. Anyway, be that as it may, that's where my sort of first experience really was with Lesotho and with Dave and I, then Swazi. I've since returned to both on a couple of occasions since that point. But that really kind of kicked it all off. After that, I guess the big one that I was invited to, and I think this was really, by this time I'd met Bob K4UEE through a couple of people, Dave included. And so I was invited to participate in that. And of course, we were very successful, 110,000 Qs actually from VA7RG. That ultimately led into a number of other expeditions, four of which were expeditions of the year. So I really consider myself to be blessed that I was given the opportunity to participate in these. Most recently, Baker, which I guess we'll see how it stacks up for expedition of the year. That's yet to be determined.
And now this message from ICOM America. I'm so excited to be able to tell you about the new ICOM IC9700 SDR transceiver. ICOM had in mind the weak signal operator when it applied its DSP and direct sampling technology to the IC9700's receiver design, allowing the operator to dig out the faintest signals from moon bounce and meteor scatter contacts. The ICOM IC9700 is a tri-band VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz transceiver. Operating modes include AM single sideband, FM, CW, RTTY, and all of the digital modes. You can even use the IC9700 to talk on the local D-Star repeater, making it an ideal rig for exploring the amateur bands 2 meters and above. For the satellite operator, the IC9700 has dual independent receivers that allow full duplex crossband operation with normal and reverse tracking, and 99 memory slots for your favorite satellites. The IC9700 is beautifully appointed with an almost identical footprint to the IC7300. It will make a beautiful sidekick to your current HF rig in your shack. With its 4.3-inch color touchscreen, you can easily control the rig and find the band activity using the waterfall display. To learn more about the IC9700 or any of the other fine ICOM products, go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur or click on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit your local ICOM dealer to purchase your IC9700, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. Well, what makes a DXpedition of the year?
Well, I think a combination of things, really. I think it's where it sits on the most wanted, the difficulty in getting to that location, then the quality of the operation. In other words, does it meet the expectations of the community? Are they working to most parts of the world, not just focusing on one? Is it operating on multiple bands, even the really tough ones? Particularly, it used to be the low-end bands, 80 and 160. Now they're a little easier to work, and the high bands, 10 and 12, are more difficult. But also just the quality of the operation. Are they working fairly good rates? Are they giving everybody a reasonable chance to work them? The signal's good. There's a lot of factors that go into it. And I think at the end of the day, if people come out of it saying, you know what, that was a fun operation, and on the other side of the fence, it was fun working them, that's a hallmark of success.
And where is Baker Island?
It's in the Pacific, just off the equator. Baker Howland. If you kind of look, American Samoa, which is where we met, and Fiji is where we ultimately returned to, are about 1,000 miles south of Baker Island.
And what makes Baker Island? What makes it rare?
Yeah, I think it's more about permission. Fish and Wildlife Service of the U.S. are very protective, as they should be, of some of the Pacific Islands. So there was an extensive process that the expedition leaders went through to ultimately gain permission to operate from the island. We also had a representative from Fish and Wildlife with us, Ali, who monitored our setup, monitored our operation, just to make sure that the island is a rookery. There's a number of millions of birds which are, basically use the island for nesting grounds, and it's pretty important for the ecosystem within that part of the world. So, there was a real concern on Fish and Wildlife Services side to just make sure that wasn't disrupted. Fortunately, at the end of the day, we coexisted, and there were no issues. So it was quite successful on that part. But because of the protection of the island by Fish and Wildlife, it makes it difficult to get permission to operate. So it's infrequently accessed. Same, by the way, is true of Desecheo K5D. There was a 300-page plus document which was submitted to gain operating permission there.
Now you've got, it appears to me, like at least 15 or 16 DXpeditions under your belt at this point. Do you have a band or mode or specialty when you travel now on DXpeditions?
Well, CW is really my passion. That kind of came from my dad, to be honest with you. During the Second World War, he ultimately became a Morse code instructor for the Royal Canadian Air Force. And I guess, my genes reflect some of that. But he was actually, purely from a CW standpoint, was one of my Elmers, Dave and Madison, and actually Steve Wright, VA7DX, who I've mentioned earlier, were my expedition Elmers. But Dad actually taught me CW, and it's become a passion to me. It's like music. I operate all modes. Baker was on sideband, voice, RIDI, FT8, which is kind of one of the new modes, and really enjoy them all. But my real passion is around CW. In terms of bands, when conditions were good, 10 and 12 were absolutely my passion. I love them, particularly with weak signal work. 30 meters, I must say, when I'm home and operating, 30 is quite often where you'll find me. I really love that band. And in fact, my quads, which I now have set up at the club, run 2 elements on 40 and 30 and 4 on everything else. I just love getting on 30 meters and booming away.
Neil, what about 30 meters is so attractive? I mean, it seems to me 20 meters is open during the day, 40 meters is open during the night, just 30 meters kind of sit in between there somehow?
Well, first off, it's CW only, although the digital modes have inhabited the upper end of it. But, I guess from my standpoint, it was one of, particularly before I started traveling so extensively, it was one of the bands that when it first opened up, there weren't a lot of multi-element arrays. So, I found with, 2 elements on my quad on 30, it kind of opened everything up. 30 is open a lot more than most people realize. In fact, on expeditions, we've noticed this, that it's pretty much open right around the clock to some area of the world. So it was new. I'd spent a ton of time up until that point on 20 meters. And when 30 opened up, it was relatively new to everybody. And everything was new. All of the countries you'd work were new. And then when I realized that I had a pretty strong signal, particularly into Europe, it was kind of fun to run pileups for some period of time. I guess you get hooked on pileups.
Now, would somebody operate, say, Meteor Scatter or EME or something like that from a Baker Island DXpedition?
We had a beacon running on 6 meters, which, in fact, we never really had a 6-meter contact. And the distances involved in the population of the islands around us weren't, I don't think, meteor scatter, although there would have been some, probably was not a productive mode. EME, to be honest with you, guys like Lance, W7GJ, have really done a lot to promote EME, particularly on 6 meters. That's one of his passions. And I've had a number of discussions with Lance, first when we went to Clipperton in 2008, requesting that we take along some EME gear. The challenge for most DXpeditions, particularly the ones that have, say, a challenging approach to the island, getting equipment on and off. Clipperton, for example, it was very dangerous getting on and off the island. So we made a decision to take only necessary equipment. CW, sideband, RIDI, those were the primary modes. There's a relatively small community on EME, and even though we wanted to address it, we felt that the risks associated with getting on and off the island just weren't worth it. At that time, and Lance and I had a couple of discussions about other operations, and I suggested to him that he get involved in one of the expeditions and focus on EME, which he's subsequently done, has done a great job of it. But what you're facing with EME particularly a fair amount of equipment. You're going to a place where you're typically running off generators. It's tough to get on and off, and you got to focus on where the highest return is going to be in terms of meeting the expectations of the community out there, and that's really going to be in the digital modes and sideband and CW, FT8, RTTY.
Lance was my guest in episode 59 of the QSO Today podcast, and I suggest if the listeners haven't heard it, they should go back there and listen. But there's a picture of him, schlepping his stuff down a rocky beach to get away from the regular, from the regular operation, so that you have a quiet place to work. And frankly, that was enough to convince me that was pretty miserable.
I suspect that was on the Clipperton expedition that came a few years after us. He did a great job, by the way, of working the EME community, but it wasn't easy.
You're now a seasoned DXpeditioner, but do you chase DX yourself when you have the time? I mean, is there a different feeling from being pursued when you're the pursuer?
I love it. I love to get on there and fight with the pileup, and it's all really. Working rare stations is a matter of strategy, is choosing the right time. You got to know the path between here and there. You got to know when it's optimally open. You got to know, who's in between, who you're competing with. And then the biggest thing is just listening, looking at the pattern that the expedition station is following in terms of responding to cues, being able to hear the expedition and hear the pileup, knowing where he's working today or at that moment and whether he's going up or down helps you position yourself. So, it's not often that you end up in a position where you're calling constantly. You can typically, after a few calls, get through. It's just a matter of timing, though. If you're trying to do somebody that's really weak on the first day of the expedition, forget it. But it's just a matter of employing the right strategy and giving it your best shots. Most of the time it works. Sometimes it doesn't.
Now, with all of these DXpeditions under your belt, do you now prepare differently than maybe you did at the beginning? How do you prepare for the next DXpedition?
Well, to be honest with you, I'd like to say that I spend a ton of time on the air practicing CW, and that I work out in the gym on a regular basis to handle the heat and the the exertion, because particularly the last few have been very challenging physically. The reality is, from a work standpoint, I've got very little time for any of those. What I do try and do is practice as much as I can fit in and get a little bit of exercise, but nowhere near the extent that is really required.
Yeah, you get a sense with a lot of when you see the pictures of the DXpeditioners, that they tend to be older guys like us. Not younger guys, and it seems to me that there's actually quite a risk to going out on a desert island in the middle of the Pacific, where you don't have. How do you guys prepare for those potential risks?
There are mitigating strategies. So there's always a team doctor who's very competent. The team doctor is well aware of all the medication, any of the medical issues, physical conditions, those kinds of things. And if there's a concern, they'll talk to the individual. I think it's very important during the course of the expedition to monitor people closely. For example, on Baker, the heat was extreme, and there was a lot of equipment to be moved. We had a lot of help from the guys on the boat. They were absolutely phenomenal. Without them, it would have been much more difficult than it was. But, the team doctor and also the expedition leaders were constantly watching people, saying, hey, stop, take a rest, cool down, get some water, stay hydrated. There's just some really simple rules that you need to follow to make sure you don't get past that point where you get into difficulties. Now, I've been on expeditions where people have dropped and required some reasonable care or attention from the doctor, but nothing that was mega serious. It could potentially have been, but was caught in time. But I've seen some pretty good examples of where you go a little bit too far, and it can be quite dangerous. The dehydration is a big issue with people operating on tropical islands.
Do the tropical islands that you visit, do they have their own sources of fresh water?
Typically not. Typically, no. Malpelo did have fresh water, but given the number of birds on the island, where the water came from, I was a bit cautious in drinking it. Typically, the support vessel will have water generation capability, and that's typically what we use as a supply.
Is there something that you pack now in your stuff that you didn't pack before, that you've discovered is something that you can't live without?
That's a really good question. I would have to say sunscreen. Years of abuse of my body is... A skin specialist says don't go out without sunscreen. I think this may sound really dumb, but I learned this from Glenn W0GJ. Just little things like these small packages of almonds, salted, that you can nibble on while you're operating, makes all the difference in the world. Things, just a few snacks that kind of remind you of home when you're sweating like a dog and you've been at it for 4 or 5 days and you're really tired. Those little things can just kind of smooth the pain a little bit. Sounds dumb, but
I get it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It improves the quality of your life, and it doesn't take a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? The biggest thing on an expedition is a compatible team. Guys and gals that get together and really enjoy working together. And I have to say that on the majority of the expeditions I've been on, with few exceptions, have been a lot of fun. We're laughing and joking and working hard, but the expedition leaders are typically pretty careful about pulling together a team of people who are really good at what they do, but also you get all these massively type A personalities together. Somehow they get together a group that actually enjoys being together.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. You sent me a picture of you operating at a field day, but the field day, it looked like your field day operating position was ergonomically designed. Was this actually out in a tent where you actually took all this ergonomic furniture to support your wrists and arms, or was this, in some EOC somewhere?
If it's the one I'm thinking of, I had headphones on and kind of a yellowy blue top in a tent. That was actually on Baker Island.
Really? So on Baker Island, you guys took ergonomic furniture in order to keep from having repetitive motion problems, right?
I wouldn't, don't get the idea that it was an executive chair with multiple adjustments on it. By no means was it that. But you know what? When you're sitting in front of a radio for 4 hours or maybe 6 hours or maybe 8 hours, depending on the shift that you're doing, you really want to have a little bit of comfort to be able to do that without being crippled by the time your shift is over. Was it luxurious? Absolutely not. But we had a very solid table with our equipment on it, lots of room. The chairs were reasonable, and that's probably been one of the biggest complaints from all of the expeditions I've been on, is when the chairs are not comfortable because of the extended hours you're spending in them. By the end of the expedition, you've got people finding anything that's soft that they're putting underneath their bottom to try and mitigate it. It's a balance between weight, space, and comfort. Because you're transporting all this stuff, and you got to carry it off the boat up to wherever you're operating from. So you want to keep it as light as possible, but on the other hand, by keeping it too light, you run into some issues.
Now, you said that when you started this job in South Africa, that you actually, I think you said this before we actually started the podcast, that you actually put your equipment in a club station. Well, what's that about? How does that work?
Well, For one thing, I moved from a house where the equipment, at least part of the equipment, was set up in a typical station to a condominium, which they weren't too anxious to have me put my stuff on the roof. Unlike Mongolia, where for the project, I organized half a dozen condos in this building on the condition I had one on the top floor and I could use the roof, which I did. That's why I was so strong out of Mongolia. But I just made a decision. I'm quite involved in the club. It's a great group of people. We're doing our best to try and encourage younger folks to get involved. And rather than just store my antennas and amplifiers and radios, which I got a ton of, I made the decision to have it relocated to the club for a couple of reasons. One, so they could be used by the club members, but also so I had a place to operate. And so that's kind of where we're at today. I moved both quads to the club. They're up on towers, my 20-meter and 6-meter monobanders, some other stuff that I've got, and then a bunch of radios and amplifiers. So they're all now being used happily by club members. We use it as a contest station. When I'm in town, I have my Flex, my ACOM 2000, and a few other little goodies tied up to Tower 1 Quad, and that's my baby while I'm in town to be able to operate there. Ultimately, and we have some internet issues at the club. Long story, won't go into it. What I'm trying to do is set up a remote station so that I can operate from here or wherever I happen to be at home, that sort of thing. We're well on the way to that. The Flex really lends itself well to that. But we need to get... We run the club off of an internet service that is part of what we call BCWARN. It's an amateur radio digital network. And the particular repeater that we're using from one of the local mountains... unfortunately, we've had a lot of tree growth, and during the wintertime when there's a lot of snow, it tends to attenuate the signals, really bringing the internet speed down. We're on a government facility which was originally a mental health institution. Perfect place for a ham club, right?
Right.
Mental health institution. The facility we've got actually for the club is about 3,200 or 3,300 square feet of area, which gives us a great meeting room, an excellent. I'll have to send you a picture of the operating room. It's really first class, and repair facility and those kind of things. So we use that facility extensively, and just my equipment was moved there so that people could use it. The club has some of its own equipment as well too, but it was better than sitting in a storage locker.
What's the name of the club?
See, Coquitlam Amateur Radio and Emergency Services Society is CARES.
Well, you've answered actually a couple of questions that I had, and that was, why not operate that remotely? What is the British Columbia Wireless Amateur Radio Network? You call it BCWARN. And what was your role in it?
Well, I guess, my role has been diminished over the years, but in the initial stages, I helped with the strategy and, just kind of getting people involved and supporting them. We had a fair number of people who were very strong digital communication specialists. And they had some phenomenal ideas. And, I guess my role was really one of listening in, throwing a few ideas around, some of the strategy and that sort of thing, but really supporting the guys that really knew what they were doing and getting things working. And basically what we wanted to do was to create a digital infrastructure that was independent of the carriers, so that in the event of a communications, say the big one hits, the threat we have in the West Coast is earthquake.
Right, the San Andreas Fault that continues all the way up to Alaska, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of faults actually that are of concern, and there's subduction. There will be subduction quakes, which result not only in a lot of damage, but tsunami effect as well too. So, what we did is we decided we wanted the ability to have a backbone network, which now extends over a number of hundreds of kilometers, running at speeds, anywhere from 10 to 50 megabits per second. And are accessible from grab-and-go kits that could be set up at various points where they have access to the, visibility to the mountaintop, which would extend both through digital communications, voice, video, and access to internet. The internet being somewhere along the network that still had a working internet feed. So it's grown extensively over time and has been integrating with a couple of other networks that were originally packet-based but are gradually moving over to use some of the digital technologies that we have. It's all using commercial equipment. It's been a lot of fun and also as a vehicle that we've used to try and encourage young folks that love computers, love the internet, love digital stuff to get into the hobby. And I think we've been fairly successful at that. And we've had great support from University of British Columbia, from the BCNet, which is a major communications provider for scientific networks across North America, across Canada primarily, but they also support things like search and rescue and groups like that. So we've been fortunate enough to be able to get our primary internet feeds off of BCNet, so independent from the telecom providers. The sites that we've got typically are co-located in hard sites that have either, the current telecom providers have allowed us to co-host at, or we have our own repeater sites, which for VHF, UHF, that we've also been able to place BCWARN equipment at.
The equipment that you're using for BCWARN, what kind of stuff are you using?
We actually started off with Linksys, believe it or not, until we opened one up after it quit working and found out that it was set on fire by our transmitting on 80 meters fairly close to it. So we kind of morphed fairly quickly into a company that provided 10 meg network that was fairly robust. Ultimately, we replaced that with Ubiquity equipment for the most part. Ubiquity has some fairly low cost and fairly durable equipment that give us some pretty good capabilities and yet are affordable for a purely volunteer organization.
Now, are you using 5 gigs, 3.5 gigs, and 2.8 as well? I mean, are you using everything that Ubiquity can make for you?
We're primarily on 5 and 2.8. We have experimented with 3.
And do the amateurs that are members of BCWARN, do they also have, is it a mesh network? Is that how you are using one of the standard amateur radio mesh networking technologies?
No, it is not mesh network. It's a backbone and feeds off that. So it's more like a traditional computer network. It's not a mesh network. But having said that, we've built in redundancy in multiple paths.
And do amateur members of the network, do they also have like network nodes? Do they act as relays?
We've primarily focused on clubs and EOCs. So because we have a lot of mountains in our area and they're nicely positioned, the repeater sites and the major links are typically on the mountaintops. And just so happens that a lot of those have VHF, UHF repeaters. So the facilities typically have backup batteries. They have good visibility into the population centers. So those link to each other, and we also link down from there to EOCs, city headquarters, to our clubs, those people who have become part of the BCWARN network.
Now, are the UHF and VHF repeaters also linking now together using this network?
Depends on the area. Vancouver Island, they've got an extensive multi-repeater network that runs up and down Vancouver Island. Some of the repeaters do. Some access the IRLP. There's a variety of different repeaters that use today's technologies. Also, the ICOM system, with D-Star, we have a number of repeaters there that are internet linked to a variety of places. Are
you doing DMR?
Yes.
Do you carry a hotspot with you?
I don't know anything about DMR.
Uh-huh.
So I've got your contact information. I can actually link you up with guys that know more about it than I do.
Well, I'm actually learning, and I have a hotspot sitting here. I found it kind of clever. There are guys in Israel that are walking around with DMR hotspots plugged into these USB battery supplies, so they talk from their handheld to their backpack and into the DMR network. I just thought maybe as a traveling guy you might have your portable DMR radio.
No. In fact, I'm embarrassed to say I don't carry any radios with me. And there's let me give you a reason why. I don't have the time, to be honest with you. But there's another reason as well too, and that is that, for example, we just had a recent incident last year where one of our travelers had a satellite phone entering India. He ended up in jail. I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but it's illegal to carry a satellite phone, sat phone, if you enter India. So,
really, oh, how interesting.
yeah. So, there was a lot of kerfuffle around that. Inside of a week, we managed to get the guy out. And I mean, the first few days, he was, fortunately, because of some connections we had, he was under house arrest in a hotel. But if we hadn't been able to do that, he would have had some quality time behind bars. So, fine. I don't know if the equipment was ever returned, but you got to be careful. I mean, I used to carry a sat phone with me wherever I went. Now I'm very cautious about where I go with that kind of equipment.
How about a satellite, like a satellite APRS device? There's a number of companies like Jarman, for example, that sell these devices for people who are traveling across the world, to allow them to send and receive at least very simple text messages, but also tell their families where they're at. Have you had any interest in those kinds of devices or used those devices, and have you ever had any problems with them?
I've used the InReach. I have one, actually, and I take it with me on expeditions, particularly when we're at sea. In terms of regular traveling here, I tend not to, but when I head up to Congo, it's one of the devices that, is fairly innocuous, looks like a pager. I sometimes will take it with me, depending on the circumstances up there at the time. They work very well. My sat phone is an Inmar sat phone, which most of the guys now are moving over to Iridium. And since Iridium's been bolstering their constellation of satellites, I'll probably switch over to Iridium. The InReach works off Iridium. And to be honest with you, no matter where I've been, whether it was Amsterdam Island, which is down into the sub-Antarctic, or out on Baker Island, it worked just fine. It was able to find a satellite and send and receive without too much difficulty. They're nice little devices.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Getting back to BCWARN for just a second, does BCWARN have a WinLink link on it for HF email if you needed to get mail off the network somehow?
Yeah, in fact, our club through BCWARN actually implemented the first WinLink node in Western Canada. So we've had a lot of experience with WinLink over the years, and it's overall it's part of what we consider as being BCWARN, yes.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Well, I'm single.
Do you attribute that to amateur radio?
No, absolutely not. Just bad choices. I've been single for 4 years, and I don't think it's had any impact on my family life whatsoever, to be honest with you. I think my family think I'm nuts for some of the places that I go to, but they're very supportive. And, I think that, they know that I've got this interest, and they're glad to see me be able to realize it. So they're very supportive.
And you have your InReach satellite device that they at least know that you're still out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're traveling across the South Pacific.
Yeah. So I take my sat phone and I take the InReach device, both. And usually, to be honest with you, on most of the expeditions, we do arrange for at least it may be a bit limited. We try and keep it to text only, but we typically do provide an email capability through UUNet, or there's a number of others that are out there that work fairly well over BGAN satellite. So it's not difficult to stay in touch. The problem is when you're on the expedition, you really have to make time to be able to send these emails, because typically once you start operating, you're at it nonstop. You're either sleeping, eating, or operating, and operating is probably 70% of your day.
In these remote places that you go, maybe not like Baker Island itself, but the places where you may stage your equipment in order to go to the next hop to get you to where you need to go, are you finding that internet connections are ubiquitous across the world now?
Yeah, I'd say pretty much. I don't think, obviously places like Clipperton or Malpelo or Desecheo don't have internet service on their own because there's nobody there. But we've established it through various satellites. But, operating out of, say, Mozambique, Tonga, they all have internet service. The differentiator is how fast it is. And if you look at the Australis, for example, it was there the year before last, 2017. The only way we got internet service was by sitting on a bench outside of the corner store across from where our operating positions were. And sometimes we got service and sometimes we didn't. Generally, we got service, but it was pretty slow. Other places, the 3G networks are fairly well established on a lot of the islands, and particularly in the African countries, the cellular network, they don't have a lot of hard infrastructure in terms of telephones, but they do have fairly good, for the most part, cellular networks, and 3G is very common. Edge, I guess, worst case, some 4G LTE. But yeah, I would say that it's fairly accessible through most of the places that we've operated from.
Are you seeing that, with your experience in Africa, that the majority of connections that Africans make are actually through the mobile networks and not through fixed line networks?
Absolutely.
So the smartphone is the computer of choice.
Absolutely. No question about it. Either smartphone or even just cellular phones with texting capabilities. And one of the big things, a lot of people here do banking through their cell phones. And, it's actually, I think, more development in North America, to be honest with you. But yeah, and you see increasingly people going to smartphones. But you got to remember the cost is pretty heavy. In Asia, of course, there's a robust business in terms of clones. I remember in Beijing, someone trying to sell me a Rolex watch, which there were two versions, a cheap one and a more expensive one. The more expensive one's starting price was $100. I couldn't tell the difference on the expensive one between it and a real one. But as I left, a guy tried to sell me an iPhone. And I looked at it, and it sure looked like an iPhone, but boy, I'll tell you, the stuff on the screen sure wasn't iPhone. So, these clones are rampant. So people in Asia have access to Chinese knockoffs, whether they be blackberries or, as I used to call them, pink berries, because they come out with a pink shell on them. We used to see a lot of them in Mongolia. These things work for some period of time, and they're dirt cheap. For straight cellular access or texting, they're probably just fine. Higher level functions that you get with apps, not so sure. Today, people save up. I mean, I see a lot here in Africa. You see kind of two levels. There are people, who are working and they're making reasonable incomes for South Africa. They quite often have smartphones. Those that aren't employed and making a half decent amount of money, or many of the unemployed, will get together and buy a simple cell phone, which they share amongst themselves, or they're fortunate enough they'll have one for themselves. But that keeps them in touch, lets them apply for jobs. allows them to do a little bit of banking if they have enough money to put into a bank. So, I think you see a number of different levels. The vast majority here, I'm sad to say, are at the lower end as opposed to those fortunate enough to, have a job that pays well to get them into a higher level of technology. The common feature amongst all of them is connectivity through the cellular providers.
What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
Well, I think that's a tough question. I would say the internet on the surface, people tend to say, is one of the biggest challenges, and that is because we got connectivity everywhere. Why would we want to talk on a radio and not be able to do video conferencing and all the stuff, the FaceTime stuff that you can do and Skyping that you can do today on a smartphone. But when you start to drill down into it, I think there are just so many things that people can be involved in today that if a technology or a hobby, has the slightest sense of being archaic, it's not thoroughly examined and considered. So it's really easy to get hooked up on your video games because the high resolution multi-shooter stuff. It's easy to use a smartphone and all the apps because it opens up a whole world of information to you. But what we're finding is we're hooking people up with the sort of the opportunity to explore other areas, and that is, if you're interested in electronics or building stuff or computers or satellites or this, that, or the next thing, once people become exposed to sort of the plethora of things that are available through amateur radio, and that's kind of the biggest exciting thing for me about it, because there's just so much out there, then you start tweaking interest. I mean, we really kind of have two big drivers, I think, for people that enroll in our courses. One of them is from a survival standpoint. We're going to have a big earthquake at some point in time, and common infrastructure is going to disappear for a few weeks. People want to know that they can stay in touch with their families. So there's increasingly a lot of people who are now taking courses for their interest in their personal well-being in the event of major disaster, but also many of them are also anxious to participate in supporting their neighbors and community at a higher level. And that econ side of it is gained some fair traction. The second chunk is from off-roaders, four-wheel drive clubs. They are out in the Tules, cell phones don't work, and they've realized that getting into ham radio and at least getting their VHF capabilities allows them to be able to talk amongst each other when they're out in nowhere land. Some of those are going to the next level, and they're getting caught up in some of the other things that ham radio has to offer. But those are, I think, vehicles for improving the hobby. But the big challenge is just getting people to look at it because there are too many other things to look at.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Everything.
Yeah, I could say the same thing.
Yeah. I guess one of the most recent things, and I see their controversy raging about FT8. I've never been, it had to drag me into RIDI contests. It was RTTY, all that diddling. Wasn't, my interest was primarily CW contesting, on occasion voice. But you know what? I get into RIDI and I realize it's just another vehicle. It's a little different. It's digital. It's handled mostly by computer. There's very little interaction. FT8, I thought, was, this isn't really ham radio. But you know what? After fiddling with it a little bit, and certainly on Baker, we stunned everybody with a number of FT8 contacts we made. In fact, one night I was sitting there running two different bands at the same time, and the average Q rate was 300 an hour between the two radios. So, and these were working people that were, in the minus 15 to minus 22 dB range. What it made me realize is it's just another facet of the hobby, but it's a great enabler at this time when we've seen the solar conditions really drop down at or near the bottom for people who don't have the ability to put a big station together to be able to work other parts of the world that they wouldn't otherwise be able to work. So I think that if anything, what it does as an enabler is generates interest, and there's been a tremendous enthusiasm. My only complaint is that there are too many people on FT8 and they're avoiding CW, but that's just going to be the way it is for a while until interest reawakens. CW is always going to be very of great interest to people. The same with RIDI in a contest. You see the bands are just absolutely packed. But outside of the contest arena, if you want to find out if a band is open, you go to the FT8 section and you find that it's very busy. Everything else is quite quiet. So people are just focusing on it because it's new. I think it's great for the hobby overall.
Frankly, the large equipment providers, ham radio equipment providers, can thank FT8 for continued sales through this low part of the cycle, I would think.
I agree.
You mentioned a couple times that CW is your favorite operating mode. I find it interesting since you weren't a novice, you didn't go through the novice experience, and you've kind of come on to CW later. What is it about CW that you like?
In part, I think, as I mentioned before, my dad, who never did get his ham ticket, was an instructor during the war, and when I expressed interest in getting my ham ticket, here in Canada, you don't get voice operating privileges. You have to operate on CW for, at that time, for the first 6 months, and you could apply to be able to get voice privileges on 10. But when he realized that, I needed to learn CW, and in fact, in the ham radio course that we both took, the instructor, although a wonderful man, was the worst CW operator I've ever heard in my life. In fact, Dad said to him, "Do you mind if I take over and do the CW practice?" So he taught me the code, and it very soon it became to me almost like listening to music. And when I put my first quad up, I was on the side of a hill that had a downslope that faced into Europe. And I'll never forget, I used to get on 20 meters and put out a call, and the conditions at that time were extraordinary. And you'd hear this big pileup of Europeans, particularly Russians, calling on CW. And you had everything from solid, clear tones to warbles from, the Arctic flutter, which, just made the hair on your arms kind of go up, at least it did to me, to some of the Russian stations with, the home-built rigs that the voltage regulation wasn't all that great on. And it all was just, kind of this mishmash of stuff. And it was like music, it just, particularly with Arctic flutter, you'd hear this ringing. And I just got hooked on it. And, that became sort of my passion. It was also sort of a legacy from my dad. And just really got into it. And it was interesting, I got licensed in 79 and operated extensively. Maybe that's why I'm single, up until, the early 80s. And then had actually the late 80s, then had about a 10-year hiatus where I was traveling extensively and basically didn't operate at all. So I went from, being pretty good at CW to, having to struggle when I restarted again to get my speeds back up again. But it was all throughout that entire period. It was just so cool to hear, the ringing, the Arctic flutter, all of that stuff, kind of come back. And it's just a lot more fun. Signal to noise ratio being a lot better than it was on phone. Although I do enjoy phone as well, but it was just all of that together was what really kind of got me into the CW thing.
Do you copy in your head?
I do. Well, let's put it this way. For the most part, I just copy and write. But yeah, I copy in my head. Yeah, I'm not using computer assist at all.
I see.
In contesting, I use N1MM Plus, which I think is brilliant. I've used a number. I started off on CT, actually. But I've always used, when I shifted to computer-generated code going out, a la N1MM, it increased my rates by 30% easily. But I still always copy. I don't use any code readers at all. And in fact, I have to tell you, code readers are a bit of a pain. I listen to a lot of 2x3s, who are presumably extra class, that you can tell they're using a code reader because it takes them 4 times to get their report in an expedition. So.
Oh, because they're going back and reading the message before they reply.
Yeah, and the fact, they're listening where there may be 2 or 3 others transmitting at the same time, because most people like to transmit instead of listening. So, the code reader, some are really good, some aren't, but none of them are good when there's a number of signals or a lot of noise on the frequency they're trying to decode.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams?
Probably, I would think to get involved in a club, because that really does expose you to sort of a fairly wide breadth of amateur radio interest, but more importantly, people who are there and probably pretty anxious to share some of their knowledge to make the whole learning process a little bit easier.
Well, I think that's great advice, actually. I think the clubs have every kind of amateur radio operator, from the young kids to the curmudgeons.
Absolutely.
Right.
There's probably a larger number of curmudgeons than the other, but at any rate, that's just the way life is.
Well, yeah. So it's a cross section of the world in one room.
Yeah.
All with the same love of amateur radio.
Absolutely right, and from all walks of life, which means their perspective on the hobby is quite different. And I have to say, all kidding aside, I look at my own club, for example. You have a typical club. You get a bunch of people. It's a small number of people are actually in there doing the dirt work, but there are a lot of people that are very giving of their knowledge and anxious to help people out if they're looking for it.
Right. I found that all you really have to do is just ask, and you'll get people that will jump to help.
Mm-hmm.
That's always been my experience. Hams like to help.
They do. Yeah, they do. No question about it. That's one thing about the fraternity is that people in general are so giving. I mean, when we came back from Amsterdam, actually before and after we returned to Perth in Australia from Amsterdam Island, just the phenomenal response from the local hams in that area in Perth was just unbelievable. I mean, people were so happy to see us. We had barbecues, we had get-togethers, but it kind of went beyond that. It established some bonds that exist even today with people that we bump into periodically on the air. Say, hey, how you doing? Blah blah blah. So, yeah, it's an interesting. Hams are an interesting group of people. Doesn't matter what walk of life you come from, whether you're the president of or a king of a country, or it doesn't matter what you do. That bond creates a common element between the two of you. I can remember listening to King Hussein of Jordan, leaving New York after a speech at the UN on 20 meters. Just talking to people once they got in, once they had taken off. He did the takeoff. He was a pilot. And then he would just sit there and chat with people. And I thought, wow, that's very cool. This guy is the head of another country, Jordan. And he's quite happy to sit and share his knowledge of ham radio and just talk to people. I just thought it was the same thing with, others that we know over the time. Joe Walsh, sort of in the top of the league with his band and his musical career. You look at, some of the Barry Goldwater, for example. They're an American senator. Just so many people that common element was ham radio, and it didn't matter who you or where you're from. You had. I
was going to say that. I've had 2 guests on the QSO Today podcast, and I'll put those links in the show notes page, who actually were called by King Hussein and asked if he could come over and operate their stations.
Really? Oh, for heaven's sake. Wow.
Right. So when he knew he was going to be someplace, then he reached out to the hams he might know in order to come over and operate their station and have an eyeball QSO. So,
isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah.
Neil, you've been a fine guest. I really appreciate your taking the time out from your busy schedule there in South Africa in Johannesburg to speak to me about ham radio and about your ham radio story. So with that, I want to thank you and wish you 73.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on, and I appreciate the opportunity just to share some of my thoughts. So 73, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Neil. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in Victor Alpha 7 Delta X-ray in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.